Welcome to the INSS podcast series. In this program, we are honored to host Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. A few weeks ago, Jonathan published his book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and the 11 Days of War. And we will talk with Jonathan about the lessons he learned from Operation Guardians of the Wall. As a researcher analyzing the Middle East and American foreign policy. We'll focus on the background to this operation and how it was presented to the public in Israel and the United States in the media, and also the implications for US-Israel relations and Middle East politics in general. We're joined by Noa Shusterman, research assistant and coordinator of the Israel-Palestinian Relations Program at the Institute. Hello, and thank you for joining us, both. So, Jonathan, let's start from the background issues that are related to the coverage of this war in the media discussion. Maybe part of them are barely delved into in the public discussion, and you wanted to point out in your book the importance of this aspect.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Yeah, look, the reason why I wrote the book was because I was able to watch Israeli TV more closely this time, thanks to smartphone and smart TV technology, and watching the coverage in Israel. And by the way, also watching the coverage in Arabic from my home here in Washington, D.C., I saw huge gaps in the coverage. Bias, fake news, I think, don't begin to cover the challenges that I witnessed in the coverage. These were editorial decisions that led to a sense that I got that the American media was covering a different war than what was being reported in the United States. And, you know, we saw this in the description of why the war erupted. The focus on the Sheikh Jarrah controversy, for example, the coverage of the Al-Jala Tower that Israel destroyed in the middle of the war, where Hamas had an office that it was using to try to jam Iron Dome. The decision or perhaps maybe not the decision, but the tweets by the IDF that there were going to be troops on the ground in Gaza just before the destruction of the metro tunnel system, and how that was reported here in the United States. In fact, how journalists got it wrong, that they falsely reported that the IDF had actually entered the Gaza Strip. There were many problems with the reporting that we saw here in the United States. In many ways, I think it minimized the role of Iran. It minimized the role of Hamas. It minimized the role of even Turkey and Qatar in this conflict. And so after a couple of days of catching my breath after watching the war, I decided that it was time to describe these many errors and these many problematic components of the coverage of the war here in the United States. And that is ultimately what led me to write the book.
Noah, when you look at what happened during the operation inside the Palestinian arena, and also in the background of this operation in the days that were actually fueled with escalation and rhetoric which was directed at the events in Jerusalem, etc. Who is responsible for the escalation?
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome.
Nice to meet you, Jonathan. So I think, like in many other cases in the Middle East, it's all a question of who you ask. So obviously, if you ask Israel what happened in May, Hamas shot rockets toward Jerusalem. It's a casus belli. It instigated riots in Jerusalem. So there's not much you can do but go into this operation. Also in the background, you have in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority that was on the one hand working a lot in order to calm down riots that were happening in the West Bank. But on the other hand, it was also playing, I would say, an active role by incitement and sort of playing this double game. But if you look from the perspective of Hamas and also the perspective of the Palestinian Authority, it was very much Israel and its actions in Jerusalem. It was over the background of Sheikh Jarrah. Israel decided during Ramadan to close off a gathering square for Palestinian youth in East Jerusalem that they would gather in during Ramadan. Israel was supposed to hold the flag parade for Independence Day. So all of these are just small events that are happening in the background. They're not related to each other, but they're all instigating a sense of escalation. And of course, we also had the issue of the Palestinian Authority parliamentary elections that were supposed to take place. And then it was supposed to take place in May. It was canceled in April. At the same time, Hamas did hold their elections and ended it by April. So all of these things that happen in the background are actually instigating this feud between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas over their aspiration to control the Palestinian arena.
Jonathan, as you underscore throughout your book, the change of US administration and the regional context are seriously important to understand what happened during and before the escalation and the operation. So how does this aspect, how are the development of events in the days of the Guardian of the Walls were affected by the regional developments that have followed the change of administration in the United States and the regional crisis with Iran? What other regional players and factors influence on the course of events between Israel and the Palestinians?
So all good questions. What I would say maybe to start with is the decision by the Biden administration to embrace the elections that Noah spoke of, I think is really important. That it was a huge mistake on the part of the administration to embrace those elections in the first place. They were, of course, the decision to hold them stemmed, I think, from the Abraham Accords. The announcement to hold those elections came shortly thereafter, really as a response to the fear among both Hamas and Fatah that they were losing the hearts and minds of the Arab world and that it was time to hold those elections again. But it was a huge mistake because allowing Hamas to take part in those elections would trigger a crisis between the United States and the Palestinian Authority. There are laws in the books here in the United States put in place by a guy you may have heard of named Joe Biden that basically says that if Hamas has any seat in a Palestinian government, then that will trigger a cut in funding and political recognition. And so there was a crisis that I think the Biden administration inadvertently walked right into. I say inadvertently because I don't think that was the intention, was to create a crisis. But ultimately, when the Biden administration changed course and encouraged Abu Mazen to cancel those elections, I think it really did trigger the crisis that we saw. Yes, you could put a finger at certain policies that Israel implemented, but I would argue that Hamas's primary reason for getting involved in this conflict in the first place was because of those canceled elections, because it had no other means to compete for leadership in the Palestinian arena. And so it reverted to what it knows best, which is war. Now, the other thing that I think is probably just worth noting is the Biden administration was quite good during the war itself. Biden, I think, showed himself to be very much the pro-Israel politician that I think he was throughout his long career in the Senate. He gave Israel all of the time and space that it needed in order to combat Hamas. And in fact, we saw compliments being handed out by IDF officials, by Netanyahu government officials, saying that Biden was giving them all the support that they needed at the UN, in Congress and elsewhere. But the last 2 days of that war was really what concerned me, because that's when we learned that there was going to be a ceasefire brokered by Egypt. It was going to take 48 hours to implement. And that's when we began to see the harsh rhetoric coming from the White House, slamming Israel for, using disproportionate force and for, not ending the conflict or not ending the operation, as you call it in Israel, quickly enough. And so we began to see, I think, signaling to a group of legislators that we refer to here in the United States as the Squad, or as I call them in my book, the Hamas Caucus, given how much support they have provided to Hamas and other terrorist groups. The last thing that I'll just note about the Biden administration's role, which cannot be ignored, is the fact that it was continued to pursue a return to the 2015 nuclear deal. And basically what that meant was that the United States was trying, and is still trying, to throw money at Iran in the form of sanctions relief and other perks in order to lure them back into a deal. The problem with that is that it automatically means that there will be funding that trickles down to Hamas indirectly from Iran, given that Iran is the #1 sponsor of Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the region. And so I think that alone revealed a serious fault line in the administration's foreign policy, and really, I think, undercut the administration's ability to play an unbiased role or a legitimate role in brokering calm in the future between Hamas and Israel. You cannot fund both sides of the conflict and also purport to try to broker that conflict. It's a very, very difficult thing for the Biden administration to do, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the future.
So now, if we focus on what happened inside the Palestinian arena with regard to the change of administration in the United States, how was the Biden administration perceived by the Palestinians, either Fatah or Hamas? And how do you think this, in turn, affected the development of the escalation leading to the operation in May?
So from the point of view of the Palestinian Authority, let's just say there was a lot of optimism and joy when Biden was elected president, instead of Trump continuing a second term. It was sort of a, we told you so. They never had to accept the Trump deal of the century. They could toss it in the trash as they wanted to. Basically, it was a sort of a recognition of the world returning and the US returning to the international norms on the resolution of the conflict. I would add, though, that there was also it was cautious optimism, because they also were aware of the fact that the US is slowly leaving the Middle East. So it's not going to be as proactive maybe in its policies, but still the policies are going to be more balanced than they were during the Trump era. And this was actually one of the reasons that Abbas decided to go to these elections, because it was a way to show, as Jonathan also said, it felt like this was the needed step to make in order to show the U.S. Administration that we're one of you, and basically join this club that Trump basically pushed them away. But at the end of the day, as time was passing by, they saw that there was no advancements, not in the reopening of the consulate in Jerusalem, not when it comes to Israel building in the settlements and construction of the settlements and any kind of, not when it comes to reopening the consulate in Jerusalem, not when it comes to opposition towards building in the settlements, or also putting in place a senior position, an official from the State Department who is supposed to be working on a special envoy who is supposed to be working on Israel-Palestinian issues. So all of these, they never happened during the Biden administration. So I think it was very quickly, the Palestinian Authority saw that it was not returning to the heydays of Obama. At the same time, Hamas was not as happy about the Biden administration. Actually, Trump was, I would say, even more convenient, because it was easier to mobilize against Israel and to mobilize against the US when you had a president such as Trump. And there was concern maybe at the beginning by Hamas that maybe Biden is going to be more similar to Obama. But as I said, they quickly things changed, and they saw things more clearly that actually it was not so much of a change as they thought it was going to be.
Yes. Jonathan, let's go to the outcomes of the events. And when we speak about the ceasefire and the Egyptian mediation, so to achieve a long-term ceasefire, what do you think about the course of event following the operation, about the Egyptian sponsorship for indirect risks between Israel and Hamas, and the new arrangements in the Gaza Strip? Does it keep us away from the next escalation, or maybe on the contrary, brings us even closer to it?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say I have a somewhat dim outlook on the future here. I don't think a whole lot has changed. There have been 4 Gaza conflicts. There will almost certainly be a 5th. I would say, actually, I agreed with 99% of what Noa has said. One thing that I would point out, though, with regard to Hamas and its position on the Biden administration and the Trump administration, is I think they were afraid to launch a conflict during the Trump era. I think they feel far less afraid to do it now. I think they see opportunities right now because they don't feel as if there are going to be any ramifications for having done so. And so I think, we're entering into at least another 3 years right now of a situation where perhaps it would be easier for Hamas to launch yet another conflict. And so I would say we should watch this space very closely. The role of Egypt, it's obviously incredibly important. They continue to try to negotiate better terms for Hamas. The only problem is that Israel can't accommodate most of them. That Israel can't give the freedom that Hamas seeks for itself, because that will ultimately blow back on Israel. And so there's limited room to maneuver, unfortunately. But I think that the biggest thing to watch right now is the fact that there are effectively 4 patrons for Hamas. We're talking about Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and to a lesser extent, Malaysia. The United States is not doing anything to curb their activity. There are no public condemnations. There is no effort to cut their funding or political or diplomatic support to Hamas on the world stage. And so as long as this dynamic continues, where there cannot be any significant progress through the Egyptians, and there is no diplomatic movement by the United States or other world powers to reduce the impact of Hamas's main patrons, my assessment is that we're headed for another round. The question is when. We've seen gaps between these wars or operations, as you call them, of 1 to 2 years, or between the last rounds, we were looking between 2014 and 2021, so 7 years. So the question is it coming quickly, or will it be a longer time of incubation? And on this, it's very, very difficult to predict.
Now, what happened in recent talks in Cairo following the ceasefire, and what are the problems until now?
So as Jonathan noted, Hamas has a lot of demands. Israel cannot accommodate most of those demands, and it also doesn't want to return to this rule of the game that Hamas instigates escalation. Then at some point we reach a ceasefire, and then Israel basically accommodates all of Hamas's wishes. So it was very adamant throughout this operation to say, we're going to stop shooting once we decide to stop shooting, and not when Hamas tells us that it's willing to stop shooting as well. So it's more of a unilateral point of view from Israel. But at the end of the day, it seems like we've returned exactly to the same dynamic that we were in before. Israel has allowed a few improvements in the lives of the Gazans when it comes to fishing mileage and to workers, Palestinian workers in Israel. supposedly it's doing it not as part of a negotiation process with Hamas. It's doing it is taking these steps because it's within its own interests in order to raise the stability in Israel. But we can also say that at the end of the day, Hamas is looking for these actions and these steps to take place. It actually just now throughout December, Hamas was not very pleased that things were not happening in the pace that it wanted it to happen. So it was threatening Egypt that if Israel does not abide, then it's going to start shooting rockets again. And it did actually shoot rockets on New Year's Eve. So we can't really say at this point where we're heading, which I definitely agree with Jonathan, that it seems like we're in the same dynamic. Having another flare up is probably a question of time. The question is, what is Israel going to do in the meantime? We did see Lapid, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is now trying to push a plan to have some sort of, I would say, a long-term arrangement with Hamas. There are a lot of questions that I don't think we should touch right now, but it begs a lot of questions on how does Israel perceive Hamas for the long term, and what are the implications for the Palestinian Authority?
So, Jonathan, as we come to the end of this discussion, I want to ask you about the lessons that you learned regarding the policy, the appropriate policy for Israel and also for the United States at the moment. I mean, if you can see at the horizon any change of policy, what should be it regarding to Israel, regarding to the relations between Israel and the Palestinians, regarding Hamas?
So I think the most important thing to remember right now is that the United States is at a very delicate and perhaps even dangerous crossroads. The United States is pivoting toward its great power competition, as we call it, with China. This is the primary focus of our foreign policy. This means that we are turning away from the Middle East, and we've seen signs of this already with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's talk about doing the same from Iraq, leaving our small outposts in Syria. There's even been discussion about exiting the multinational forces in the Sinai. There is a sense, I think, among what we call here our neo-isolationists, which exist both in the Democratic and Republican parties, that the Middle East is not worth the fight, that we've lost too much blood and treasure over the years, and that it's time to leave. And so I would argue that the big lesson to learn from this conflict, and I do talk about this at the end of the book, is that if we're leaving the Middle East, that we need to leave it into the hands of our allies that think the way that we do, that hold the same values that we do. I think that Israel is inheriting this responsibility, whether it likes it or not. Perhaps other countries from the Gulf, Israel's partners from the Abraham Accords, could also be included in this new arrangement. But I do get a sense that Israel is going to be left to its own devices, that it's going to have to solve some of these problems on its own, more so than it's done in the past. So even as we hear the Biden administration talk about engagement and rebuilding alliances, one gets a sense that things are changing. And those changes, I think, really do fall upon the shoulders of Israel, more so than anyone else in the region right now, if the goal is to keep forces like Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah at bay. And so I think we're at a moment of great change. I hope that this doesn't open the floodgates for additional conflict, but I do get a sense that with the United States leaving without a superpower to regulate the rules of the game, that we could be in for additional conflicts in the future. And that, of course, is something that Israel will have to think about very carefully.
So I will ask also you, Noa, what do you think Israel should do, as we don't see the end of the problems in Gaza and the end of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians? What is the policy that Israel should adopt?
So I believe there are two main policy takeaways from the events of May. First of all is understanding the implications of what we call the post-Abbas days. realizing that Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, president of the Palestinian Authority, is towards the end of his term, he already finished his term, but his days as a president are, I would say, numbered. He's 86, his health is not the best. At the end of the day, he's going to have to leave his seat. And then the question is, who's going to replace him? And we do see already for the past, I would say, even 2 years, we've been seeing candidates who are slowly trying to find their spot and to improve their position for those post-Abbas days. And one of those candidates is Hamas. And Hamas is playing the game of taking over the Palestinian Authority and over the Palestinian arena and gaining control over what they believe should be the objectives of the Palestinian arena. And I think for Israel, then, it needs to realize, how does it actually strengthen the Palestinian Authority instead of strengthening Hamas, which I would say, side note, that's kind of what we're doing if we're now going into an arrangement with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But then the other end of the coin is, then how do we strengthen the PA, not only in economic terms, which is mostly what Israel is now talking about, but also politically. And I think that's what mostly is necessary. And the second takeaway is the ability to mobilize to gain Palestinian mobilization through Jerusalem, and the power that Jerusalem has on the Palestinian arena. And I think that Israel should tread more lightly and carefully when it comes to Jerusalem, and realize that this is a barrel of firearms that's waiting to explode, and Israel has the ability to improve the lives of the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, and to be more cautious in how it plays out the events in Jerusalem.
So I guess that we have to end at this point without much optimism about the near future, but with great insights from both of you. Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Noa Shusterman, thank you very much for sharing your views. And we'll just mention once again, congratulations for your new book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and the 11 Days of War. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.